Hello and thanks for joining me. Today I want to do a quick chat on The Coming of the Third Reich by Richard J. Evans, which is the most recent book that I finished. And following this chat, I'll also touch base briefly on what I'm currently reading, as well as I'll do a drawing to see what my next read is going to be. But The Coming of the Third Reich by Richard J. Evans. This was originally published back in 2003 and first published in the U.S., from what I could tell, in 2004. The author here, Richard J. Evans, is the professor of modern history at Cambridge, and this wound up being a 3-volume history of the Third Reich, of the Nazi era of Germany in the middle of the 20th century, and this is volume 1 of that 3-volume history. I heard a lot of good things about this. I chose it to put on my priority reading list. This fell under one of my reading theme of history. This was one of my history choices, and I really wanted to at least get the first volume of this history read this year, so that's why I priority read it. And I'm so glad I did, because, you know, I had always never really had a really good understanding, I don't think, of how the whole rise of Nazism happened in a country like Germany, which is a wealthy, prosperous country that has a lot of culture, had centuries of music, classical music, and just beautiful music, literature, architecture. It was just had a wonderful sort of what I would have thought would have been a stable culture that would have really inhibited this type of thing. And so I had never really been able to understand how the country, how Hitler ended up taking power. And now I think I do. This book was very, readable. It was meant for. There's a prologue where the author explains that he wants this book to be for the general public, and it really, reads really well, and it's really, for the general audience. And so I really took away a lot from it. It's a book like this. I don't want the chat to turn into a history lesson, because I'm not qualified to teach history, especially something as complicated with as many variables as there were in Germany leading up to the rise of Nazism. That's the number one thing I think to consider that I took away, was that there is no one, or even there's not even a dozen factors. It was a soup that had to, the ingredients fell into place in just the right way, really, where Hitler was able to assume power. The deck was really stacked against him at first. There was a lot of opposition, and there was very vibrant other political parties in Germany at the time. And so the fact that he did ultimately assume complete control and suspend democracy in a relatively short amount of time is pretty amazing. But after reading this book, I think I have a pretty good idea of how that happened, but I don't think I have time to explain it, or even really could explain it verbally in a short chat like this. But what I did, I jotted down a few key points. As I was reading, I made some notes I read this electronically, and so I thought what I would do is I would just kind of go through these key points, because to me these key points really jumped out at me as kind of surprises, like things I didn't really know. And so I just thought I would chat about those for a bit. So, number one, Nazism was only one of a number of violent dictatorships in Europe at the time. So it was part of a trend. So, I think a lot of times I have thought that, it just sort of came out of the blue in Germany and Italy and Spain, and, sort of isolated. But there was a whole trend really for authoritarianism and dictatorship at the time, and Nazism was part of that. And within Germany itself, it wasn't even the only party that was authoritarian. As a matter of fact, the democracy that they had, the Weimar Republic that they had immediately prior to Nazism, was really hated by a large coalition of people and political parties within Germany. It was not a well-loved system of government, and so Nazism was not an authoritarian dictatorship that came out of the blue. It existed in in a context with other authoritarian movements, both within Germany and without. And another interesting thing that I took away was the Reich thing, like the Third Reich. Like, why is it the Third Reich? What's the First and Second Reich? Well, this book explains the First Reich is actually Charlemagne's Holy Roman Empire from, I didn't write down the year, but that Holy Roman Empire lasted about 1,000 years. I think it started something like around 800 or 900. I'm not sure exactly. And it wound up. It might have even been earlier than that. Don't quote me on the year for the beginning of Holy Roman Empire. Off the top of my head, I can't remember when Charlemagne became the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. But anyway, First Reich, Holy Roman Empire. Second Reich, Bismarck, the unification of Germany. So this is another kind of thing that I don't know that's generally known, but that Germany was not a unified nation state until 1871. So relatively for Europe, relatively late. And it was the Second Reich was this Bismarck, when they had the Kaisers. And then that came to an end with the end of World War I, with the defeat of Germany in World War I. Then they instituted the Weimar Republic in 1919, which was this sort of democratic, rule by constitution that they had from the year 1919 up until Hitler assumed power in 1933, which was, like I mentioned, very unpopular for lots of reasons, which I'll talk about some of them as we go through these key points. So, another key point, the defeat in 1918. So surprising to me that the German soldiers and the German people did not think they were losing World War I. So when they were actually defeated, it came as a complete shock to them. And then right after the defeat, the Weimar Republic was instituted, as well as these really severe reparations, and that Germany had to pay the other powers in Europe, and also boundaries and things that they had to adhere to. Germany had a lot of its power stripped away from it as far as being able to have a military and things like that. So to many people in Germany and the military, this was a humiliating thing. They did not really expect to lose World War I. And so when they did, it was quite a shock, to their cultural psyche. And then another key point was the paramilitary forces that the political parties had at the time. I didn't know this. So, I think of the Nazis and the brown shirts that the Nazis had. We hear about the brown shirts as part of the violence of the Nazi party, but every political party, both on the right and on the left, had paramilitary organizations associated with them that caused various levels of political violence. So the Nazis were not alone in having political violence and conducting political violence. The other parties did this as well. I did not realize that. Of course, the brown shirts with the Nazis wound up taking this to a big extreme once Hitler assumed power in 1933. So, yeah. Oh, and another thing I was going to say about that was the history of authoritarianism in Germany. I mentioned that Germany became a nation state only in 1871, and it was with the Kaiser, so it was an authoritarian state. It only had a democracy in 1919, so it did not have democratic. The democratic ideas were not really embedded deeply in people's psyche and the cultural psyche, and so authoritarianism was not something that was strange and alien to people in Germany at the time, having come from an imperial system with a Kaiser just immediately prior to the Weimar Republic. So, yeah, the culture of hypermasculinity. So following the defeat in World War I, this book makes the point of this culture of hypermasculinity. He calls it, in some instances, male supremacy. This sort of very masculine, very aggressive cultural milieu that they had following the defeat, probably due to some some cultural resonance through the defeat, the psychological resonance of the defeat, resulted in this hyper-masculinity, which really fed into this political violence and really, made a really fertile ground for a group like the Nazis. And then the hyperinflation and the Great Depression. So hyperinflation, they had this incredible inflation, impossible for me to even fathom how bad their inflation was, where the prices of things would change by the hour. And just amazing. The book goes into quite a detail about that. This was during the Weimar Republic, so the people of Germany really blamed the Weimar Republic they blamed their government for the loss in World War I and the humiliation of the peace terms, and then they also blamed the Weimar Republic for this hyperinflation and this terrible economy, which wasn't entirely the Republic's fault, of course, but this is who got the blame for it. So they were against their government in that regard. But then, in 1929, along comes the Great Worldwide Depression that the whole world experienced, which just exacerbated the economic problems in Germany. So that was another thing that sort of laid the groundwork for the rise of a group like the Nazis. People were really looking for, stability and someone who could provide that. So, January 30th, 1933, Hitler, the book goes into a great detail about the political parties and the maneuverings that went on, that eventually Hitler wound up as chancellor, being appointed chancellor in January 30th, 1933. Then rapidly he consolidated power. Less than a month later was the Reichstag Fire, which was the Reichstag was the government building, the main government building. Like in the U.S., it would be the equivalent to our Capitol, and a communist sympathizer who is thought, according to this book anyway, thought to have been acting alone. I think there's been some controversy about that, but considered to be acting alone, set fire to the Reichstag and burned down the Reichstag building. And Hitler used this fire as an excuse that the communists were plotting to take over. And he then instituted something called the Enabling Law, which basically ended democracy in Germany. And I'll have a bit more about that here in a moment. But in the meantime, the communist revolution has occurred in Russia. So the whole Bolshevik and communist threat was very prevalent in people's minds in Germany and really elsewhere as well at that point in history. So, mentioned about the Reichstag fire. Another interesting thing was to me that Dachau, the first concentration camp, was opened on March 20th. So Hitler took power on January 30th, 1933. The Reichstag fire is February 28th, the first political concentration camp. This was for political prisoners at that time, not Jewish people yet, per se, so that short amount of time. By the time a few months roll around, this book basically covers up until about the middle of 1933 when Hitler has consolidated his power. The other political parties have been eliminated and destroyed, and their members either killed, suppressed, or sent to concentration camps, or they've immigrated, and that trade unions have been destroyed, all in just a span of a few months. So it's just breathtaking how quickly that happened. Before I run out of time, I wanted to read a really cool quote. This is from a social democrat, an opposition party to Hitler, who I think is just very, very brave, because as Hitler was about to pass the Enabling Act, this person stood up. This person had a cyanide capsule in their pocket in case the brown shirts hauled him away to a camp to torture him, or to a concentration camp following this speech. But he gave this speech with, let's see if I can find it real quick. Here it is. He gave the speech right as in front of Hitler, right as the Enabling Act was being passed. In this historic hour, we German Social Democrats solemnly profess our allegiance to the basic principles of humanity and justice, freedom and socialism. No enabling law gives you the right to annihilate ideas that are eternal and indestructible. The anti-socialist law did not annihilate the Social Democrats. Social democracy can also draw new strength from fresh persecutions. We greet new persecutions and the hard-pressed. Their steadfastness and loyalty deserve admiration. The courage of their convictions, their unbroken confidence, vouch for a brighter future. Unfortunately, that was not to be. The opposition was crushed, and Hitler did, assume power. And then Volume 2 explores that power. So, what I am currently reading. I'm going to end that chat with that and just touch base briefly on what I'm currently reading. I am reading New Finnish Grammar. Oh, I don't have the cover. New Finnish Grammar. It's a work of fiction, and it is about a guy who's lost his memory, and he thinks he's Finnish, so he's learning Finnish, the language, as part of his identity. So it's really cool. I'm about a fourth of the way through it. I should be finished with it fairly soon. But before I run out of time, I want to do a quick drawing to see what my next read is going to be. I'm just going to choose this one. It is going to be Us and Them, which I have right here. Understanding Your Tribal Mind. This is a work of nonfiction by David Berreby. This also explores identity. This was one of my priority reading theme book selections about identity, exploring our tribal minds. So that'll be coming up following New Finnish Grammar. So until next time, take care. Bye.